The interview wasn't supposed to last more than 10 minutes. She was nervous, too polite, grateful for every question. The Mafia boss almost ended it early until he noticed her hands. They were shaking, not from fear of the interview, from something older, something she didn't want anyone to see. That was the moment he made a decision that had nothing to do with the job. What Caspian Rivara didn't know was that the woman sitting across from him wasn't even supposed to be there, and what she was hiding under those long sleeves would eventually force him to break every rule he'd ever made for himself. Caspian Rivara didn't conduct interviews. He hadn't personally spoken to a potential hire in over 6 years. That was Maddox's job, his consigliere, his shadow, the man who handled the operational machinery of the Rivera Empire, while Caspian dealt with the architecture. Maddox screened, Maddox vetted, Maddox decided who walked through the doors of Rivara Holdings and who was turned away before they reached the elevator. But Maddox was in Philadelphia. A supply chain issue with one of their legitimate construction subsidiaries had required his personal attention, and it had pulled him away from Hartford for 3 days. In his absence, 2 interviews had been scheduled for an administrative assistant position at the firm's downtown office, a job that existed more for laundering paperwork than any real secretarial need. Caspian had considered canceling the interviews. He had no interest in the process, the small talk, the forced enthusiasm, the parade of people trying to present the most employable versions of themselves. He found it exhausting, not because he lacked patience. Patience was, in many ways, the defining quality of his success, but because he found the dishonesty of it tedious. People sat in chairs and told you what they thought you wanted to hear, and you sat across from them knowing they were performing, and the entire exercise was a mutual agreement to pretend. But the interviews were already scheduled, and Caspian believed in honoring commitments, even small ones. It was one of the principles his mother had embedded in him during the years when she was teaching him how to lead. The man who keeps his word on small things will be trusted with large ones. The man who breaks promises because they're inconvenient will be broken by them. The first candidate had been unremarkable, 42 years old, an accounting background, a flat affect. She answered every question with bureaucratic precision and left without once making eye contact. Caspian had dismissed her before the door closed behind her. The second name on the list was Leora Tenley. She was late, not dramatically late. Not late in the way that communicated disrespect. She was 4 minutes late. And when the receptionist finally brought her in, Leora walked into the conference room like someone who had spent those 4 minutes trying to convince herself not to run. Caspian was standing by the window when she entered. He turned slowly, hands in the pockets of his charcoal suit, and studied her the way he studied everyone. Not with warmth, not with judgment, but with a careful, measured patience that could feel, to those on the receiving end, like being read. She was 23. She looked younger. Her dark hair was pulled back into a low ponytail that she'd clearly done in a hurry. A few loose strands fell against her neck, and she kept reaching up to tuck them behind her ear, a gesture so habitual it seemed involuntary. She wore a blouse that was slightly too large in the shoulders, as if borrowed. And then her shoes, black flats, had been polished but were cracking at the sides. "Miss Tenley?" he said. She nodded quickly. Yes, sir. I apologize for being late. There was traffic near the bridge and I..." "Sit down." She sat. It wasn't an unkind command, but she obeyed it with a swiftness that caught his attention. Not because it was unusual in his world. People obeyed Caspian Rivara without hesitation, as a matter of survival, but because there was something in the way she responded. Not deference to power. Something else. A conditioned reflex. A flinch, disguised as obedience. The conference room was cold, as Caspian kept most of his spaces. A long glass table stretched between them, a pitcher of water and 2 clean glasses placed at the center by someone who understood that he expected precision in all things. Though the walls were bare, except for a single framed photograph of Hartford's skyline taken from the river, a gift from the city's former mayor who owed Caspian more than gratitude. Your resume says you attended Briarfield Community College, Caspian said, flipping through the single sheet she'd submitted. It was thin, sparse, the kind of resume that told him more in what it omitted than in what it included. Yes, I didn't finish. I completed 3 semesters. Why did you stop? Her hands moved to her lap, both of them pressed together. Personal reasons. He didn't push, not because he cared about her privacy, but because he recognized a wall when he saw one, and he understood that pushing against walls prematurely was how you made enemies in rooms where you hadn't yet decided whether you wanted allies. You've listed experience as a cashier, a filing clerk at a medical office, and 6 months as a receptionist at a law firm. Yes? The law firm, Caldwell and Price? They downsized. They closed, Caspian corrected, without malice, her cheeks flushed. Yes, they closed. He set the resume down and looked at her, not at the document, not at the glass wall behind her, but at her. She met his gaze for approximately 1 second before her eyes dropped to the table. Why do you want this job, Miss Tenley? The question seemed to surprise her, as if she'd prepared for hostility and received neutrality instead. She opened her mouth, closed it, and then spoke with a voice that was steady, only because she was holding it in place with everything she had. Because I need it. There was no pitch, in no rehearsed speech about passion or career goals. Just 4 words delivered with a rawness that most people who sat in that chair never permitted themselves. Caspian studied her hands. They were trembling. Not the kind of trembling that comes from caffeine or cold air. This was a tremor rooted in something deeper, fatigue maybe, chronic stress, the kind of exhaustion that nests in the nervous system and sets up permanent residence. He noticed something else, her left wrist, where the sleeve had ridden up just slightly as she reached for the glass of water, showed the faint edge of something, a shadow of color against her skin that was neither natural nor cosmetic. She saw him notice. She pulled her sleeve down. The gesture was fast, practiced, seamless. She'd done it 1,000 times. The position pays $48,000 a year, he said. Benefits begin after 90 days. Hours are 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. Overtime is available but not required. Leora blinked. You mean, you start Monday? She stared at him. For the first time since she'd walked into the room, her composure cracked. Not from pain, but from something she seemed unprepared to feel. Gratitude, maybe, or disbelief. Sir, don't you need to check my references or... Monday, 8 a.m. Ask the receptionist for your parking pass on the way out. He turned back to the window. She didn't move for a long moment, and then, quietly, she stood, smoothed the front of her blouse and said, Thank you, Thank you. She left the room without looking back. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Das Caspian stood at the window and watched the city below. Cars moving, people walking, a world that continued regardless of what happened inside the buildings that contained it. He picked up his phone and dialed Maddox. I filled the position, he said. Without me. You were unavailable. A pause. Who is she? Leora Tenley. 23. Community college, incomplete. No criminal record, no debts that I could see. And what made you hire her? Caspian looked at the chair where she'd been sitting, the glass of water she'd poured but never drank, the faint indentation in the leather where her body had pressed against it. She was honest, he said, and then he hung up. What he didn't say, what he wouldn't say to anyone, was that it wasn't her honesty that had stayed with him. It was her hands. The way they shook, and the way she pulled her sleeve down so quickly that it looked like breathing. The way she'd hidden something under that fabric with the skill of someone who had been hiding things for a very long time. She arrived at 7:47 a.m. on her first Monday, 13 minutes early. The building, a 12-story glass tower on Prospect Avenue that served as the legitimate face of the Rivara organization, was quiet that early, populated only by security and the cleaning crew. Leora had dressed carefully, a navy blouse with sleeves that reached her wrists, dark slacks, her hair pulled back more neatly than it had been during the interview. She carried a bag from a discount retailer that contained her lunch, a sandwich she had made at 5 a.m. before her son woke up. She had been awake since 4:30, not from excitement. Though there was some of that. A thin, nervous thread of it running beneath everything else. She had been awake because Corvin had come home at 2 a.m., loud enough to wake Oren, and she had spent the next 2 hours calming the boy, cleaning up the bottles Corvin had left on the kitchen counter, and setting her alarm for a time she knew would allow her to be out of the apartment before he woke. She had learned that mornings were safest when she was already gone. She sat in her car in the Rivara Holdings parking garage for 12 minutes before going inside. She used the rearview mirror to check her makeup, not vanity, but inventory. The concealer under her jaw was holding. The collar of her blouse covered the rest. She looked to herself like someone who had slept well and prepared carefully. And the distance between that image and the truth was a gap she had become expert at navigating. Her son, Oren, 3 years old, round-faced, solemn, with his mother's dark eyes and a quietness that was, for a child his age, unsettling. He did not babble the way other toddlers did. He watched, he waited. He had learned in 3 short years of life that silence was safer than sound. Other mothers at the playground noticed it. They would try to engage him, holding out toys, making faces, speaking in the high, bright voices that toddlers are supposed to respond to. And Oren would look at them the way a much older person might, assessing, calculating, determining whether this person was safe before offering any piece of himself. Most of the mothers eventually stopped trying. Even they would turn to each other with pitying looks and say things like, "He's just shy," or "He'll grow out of it," not understanding that what they were witnessing wasn't shyness. It was strategy, a 3-year-old's survival strategy, developed in a home where the wrong sound at the wrong moment could turn a quiet evening into something else entirely. Leora had dropped Oren at her neighbor's apartment at 6:30 a.m., a retired woman named Genera Fultz, who watched him for a rate Leora could barely afford. Genera was patient and kind, and she never asked why Oren sometimes flinched when doors closed too quickly. She had noticed, of course. Genera Fultz was 71 years old and had raised 5 children and buried 1 husband, and seen enough of life to recognize the signs. But she was also wise enough to know that asking Leora directly would only cause the young woman to withdraw, to pull Oren from her care and find someone else, someone who noticed less. So Genera said nothing. She kept Oren safe during the hours he was in her apartment, and she fed him the snacks his mother could not always afford, and she held him when he cried without asking why, and she hoped, with the quiet, persistent hope of an old woman who had seen too much, that something would eventually change. The office assigned to Leora was small but clean. A desk, a computer, a filing cabinet, and a window that overlooked the parking garage. Her responsibilities were straightforward: process incoming invoices, maintain appointment calendars, answer the second phone line, and organize documents that Maddox's team generated for the firm's above-board operations. Nothing sensitive, nothing that required clearance. A legitimate job in a building that housed many things that were not. Caspian did not interact with her directly during that first week. He existed several floors above, in a penthouse office that most employees never entered. But he had cameras. Not surveillance in the paranoid sense. They were standard security systems for a building that housed millions in assets. And he reviewed them occasionally, the way a man who had built an empire by paying attention reviewed everything occasionally. He saw her arrive early each morning. He saw her eat lunch at her desk, alone, the same sandwich every day, turkey on white bread, an apple, a bottle of water she refilled from the break room tap. And he saw her leave at exactly 5:01 p.m., moving through the lobby with a pace that was just slightly too fast, as if she was racing a clock that had nothing to do with work. By the second week, Maddox had returned from Philadelphia and reviewed the new hire himself. "She's competent," he told Caspian, leaning against the doorframe of the penthouse office. Maddox was 51, silver-haired, Built like a man who had stopped fighting, but hadn't stopped training. He wore his loyalty to Caspian the way some men wore wedding rings, visibly, permanently, without apology. Doesn't talk much, does the work. No complaints from the floor managers. Good. Ransom in accounting says she's the fastest filer they've had in 2 years. Good. Maddox hesitated. "Juan, you hired her in under 10 minutes. I did. That's unusual for you." Caspian looked up from the document he was reading. His gaze was the kind that made most men reconsider their next sentence. Maddox was not most men. "She needed the job," Caspian said simply. "Everyone who applies needs the job. Not the way she did." Maddox studied his boss for a moment, then nodded. He had worked with Caspian Rivara for 19 years, since Caspian was barely 18 and already rebuilding what his father had left behind. In that time, Maddox had learned that Caspian's instincts were not random. When he acted without explanation, there was always a reason. It just took time for the reason to become visible. The third week was when it began. Monday. Leora arrived at her usual time, but something was different. She wore sunglasses. And not outside, where the September morning was bright enough to justify them. Inside, at her desk. She kept them on as she hung her coat, as she powered up her computer, as she opened the first stack of invoices. When Ransom Hetrick from accounting passed her desk, on his way to the break room, he paused. "You okay, Leora?" She looked up, a movement that seemed to cost her effort. The sunglasses were large, dark, the kind that covered not just her eyes, but the skin beneath them. "Migraine," she said, and she smiled. A small, practiced, completely convincing smile. Ransom nodded sympathetically and moved on. By noon, the sunglasses were off. Whatever had been beneath them was now concealed by makeup applied in the restroom during her break. Caspian would later learn this from the security footage, even though he wouldn't review it until later, when the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Tuesday of the same week. Leora wore a cardigan despite the office temperature. It was buttoned to her wrists. When she reached across her desk for the stapler, the fabric rode up her forearm for just a moment, enough for the overhead fluorescent to catch what was underneath. A bruise. Not fresh, yellowing at the edges. The kind that takes days to develop that particular hue of sickened green. She pulled the sleeve down. Wednesday, she moved differently. There was a stiffness in her left side that altered her gait. Not dramatically, but enough. She carried her lunch bag in her right hand only. She reached for objects with her right arm only. When she sat down, she lowered herself slowly, carefully, in the way someone sits when their ribs are screaming. Thursday, she called in sick. Friday, she returned. She was quieter than usual, which was notable because Leora Tenley was already one of the quietest people in the building. She spoke when spoken to, completed her assignments with meticulous precision, and ate her lunch alone with the door to her small office closed. But now there was something else, a guardedness, a new layer of invisible armor that she wore the way she wore those cardigans, constantly, deliberately, hoping no one would notice that it didn't quite fit the weather. Caspian reviewed 3 days of footage on Friday evening, after the building had emptied, and he sat in his darkened office and watched the monitors, not with suspicion, but with the careful attention of a man who had survived by reading what others concealed. He watched her arrive Monday with the sunglasses. He watched her flinch when Ransom Hetrick reached past her to grab a file on Tuesday. A flinch so quick it could have been a shadow, except that Caspian Rivara did not mistake shadows for flinches. He watched her sit down on Wednesday with the controlled slowness of a person managing pain. He watched the empty desk on Thursday. He watched her return on Friday wearing a turtleneck in 74-degree heat. He closed the monitor and sat in the dark for a long time. There was a code that governed Caspian Rivara's world. Not the law. Laws were written by men who had never lived in the spaces between power and survival. His code was older, more personal. It had been shaped by his mother, Isolde, who had raised him alone after his father's death, and who had taught him, in the quiet hours of a childhood that was anything but quiet, that there were certain things a man with power must never tolerate. Cruelty against those who could not protect themselves was one of them. Exploitation of vulnerability was another, and the deliberate systematic destruction of a person's dignity, whether by a rival, an enemy, or someone who claimed to love them, was the one that Caspian's mother had spoken of with a coldness in her voice that he had never heard her use for any other subject. He didn't know yet what was happening to Leora Tenley. He had suspicions, instincts, patterns that his mind was assembling into a picture he hadn't yet decided to examine closely. But he knew one thing: something was wrong, and it was getting worse. October arrived with cooler air and the kind of gray skies that made Hartford look like a photograph from a different era. The trees along Prospect Avenue turned amber and rust, and the building's heating system kicked into full operation, filling every floor with a dry, persistent warmth that made heavy clothing unnecessary. Leora continued to wear long sleeves. She had been employed at Rivara Holdings for 5 weeks now, and by most measures she was exemplary. Her filing was immaculate. Her calendar management was precise. She had earned the quiet respect of the floor staff, not through personality, because she rarely shared anything personal, but through reliability. She was there every morning. She did the work. She didn't complain. But the signs were escalating. Week 5. She arrived on Tuesday with her left hand wrapped in an elastic bandage. When Ransom asked, she said she'd burned it making dinner. The explanation was plausible. Burns happen. Bandages happen. Ransom nodded and moved on. But Caspian, reviewing footage from a different angle, noticed that the bandage covered not just her hand, but extended up her wrist, and that when she unwrapped it in the restroom during lunch to reapply it, the injury beneath was not a burn. It was a series of marks. Finger-shaped, the kind of marks that come from a grip that was not meant to hold, but to hurt. Week 6, she wore a scarf, not outside where the October wind justified it, but inside all day, and wrapped high around her neck. She adjusted it constantly, a tic that became so frequent that Emberly Voss, the office manager, finally asked if she was cold. "I'm coming down with something," Leora said. "Sore throat." She said it with such ease, such automatic fluency. The lie arrived before the question had fully landed, as if she had a library of explanations stored and ready, filed by body part and level of visibility. Caspian made his first direct approach on a Wednesday afternoon, in the 6th week. He had come down to the 4th floor for a meeting with one of his attorneys, a rare enough occurrence that it generated whispers among the staff. And on his way back to the elevator, he stopped at Leora's office. The door was open. She was at her desk, typing. The scarf was still in place, her hair pulled back as always, and exposed the side of her neck where the scarf didn't quite reach, and there, just above the collarbone, barely visible, was a mark, purplish, recent. He knocked on the doorframe. She startled, not the normal startle of someone interrupted, the full-body startle of someone who lives in a state of perpetual alert. Her shoulders came up, her hands left the keyboard and went to her lap. Her eyes, those dark, careful eyes, found him, and for a moment he saw it. The raw, unfiltered fear that lived beneath every practiced smile and every rehearsed excuse. Then it was gone, replaced by the mask. "Mr. Rivara," she said and stood. Can I help you with something?" "Sit down, Miss Tenley." She sat, that same immediate obedience that troubled him in the interview. He stepped into her office and closed the door, and she watched him do it, and he saw her posture shift, a barely perceptible tightening, as if the closing of a door was a signal her body had learned to interpret as danger. He sat in the chair across from her desk. "How are you settling in?" "Fine. Good. Great, actually. The work is... I really enjoy it." "Good." A pause. "Are you well?" The question was simple, 2 words, but Leora received it like a blow. Her mouth opened, then closed. Her hand drifted to the scarf at her neck, an unconscious gesture, and she caught herself, redirected the hand to the desk. pressed it flat against the surface. "I'm fine," she said. "Just, the weather's been changing and I think I caught a bug." "You burned your hand last week." "Making dinner." "Silly mistake. The pan was..." "And the week before that." "Oh, you called in sick on Thursday." She went still, not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of an animal that has been spotted. "I had a stomach bug," she said. "It was going around Oren's daycare." "Oren is your son?" "Yes." The first real warmth in her voice. "He's 3. Caspian nodded slowly. "Miss Tenley, I'm going to ask you something, and I'd like you to answer honestly." Her hands were back in her lap, pressed together, shaking. "Is someone hurting you?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. It expanded to fill every corner, pressing against the walls, pushing against the window. Leora's face went through a sequence of expressions so rapid that a less observant man would have missed them. Shock, fear, recognition, calculation, and then the one that settled, the one she chose, offense. "What?" No, of course not. Why would you ask me that?" "Because you've come to work 3 times in 6 weeks with injuries that you've explained with stories that don't match what I'm seeing." "I told you I'm clumsy. You can ask anyone, I've always been clumsy." "The marks on your wrist weren't from a burn." She pulled her hand under the desk. "They were. They absolutely were. I grabbed the pan wrong and..." "Leora." The use of her first name stopped her. She looked at him, and in that look, he saw everything she was fighting to conceal. The exhaustion, the shame, the desperate need to maintain the story that kept her world from collapsing. "I'm fine, Mr. Rivara," she said. Her voice was steady, firm, convincing, if you didn't know what to listen for. "I appreciate your concern. I really do. But I'm fine." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he stood. "If that changes," he said, "my door is open." She nodded. "Thank you." He left. She sat alone in her office for 14 minutes after he was gone. She did not type. She did not reach for her phone. She sat with her hands in her lap, shaking, staring at the space where he had been, and tried to breathe. The phone calls started during week 7. Leora's personal cell would ring at unpredictable intervals throughout the day, sometimes once, sometimes 6 or 7 times in a row. She always stepped out to answer, always returned looking slightly diminished, as if each call subtracted something from her. She never mentioned the calls. She never explained them. But her productivity dipped noticeably in the hours that followed, and on 2 occasions, Emberly Voss found her in the restroom, not crying, not visibly upset, just standing at the sink, gripping the porcelain, staring at her own reflection with an expression that Emberly would later describe to her husband as empty. One afternoon, Caspian was on the 4th floor again when Leora's phone rang. She was at the copy machine, and she answered it with a quickness that suggested not eagerness, but fear of what would happen if she didn't answer quickly enough. "Hey," she said. Her voice changed, dropped, softened, became smaller. "No, I'm at work. I can't." I know, I'm sorry. I didn't mean..." "Corvin, please," I said I was sorry." A pause. Whatever was said on the other end made her close her eyes. "I'll be home by 6. Yes, okay, I will, I promise." "No, please don't. He's fine. He's at Ganara's and he's fine." Please don't call her." "I'll handle it. Okay, bye." She hung up. She stood at the copy machine for a moment, pressing the phone against her chest, and then she tucked it into her pocket and returned to her office with her head down. Caspian, standing in the hallway 10 feet away, had heard every word. Corvin. He filed the name away in the same mental vault where he stored the names of allies, enemies, and the small number of people who existed in the space between. People he had not yet decided how to categorize. That evening he called Maddox. "I need information on someone." "Who?" "A man named Corvin, connected to Leora Tenley." Maddox was quiet for a moment. "The new hire?" "Yes." "What kind of information?" "Everything." Maddox didn't ask why. He never did. How fast?" "Tomorrow." The file arrived at 9 a.m. the next morning, delivered not digitally, but in a physical folder, Maddox's preference for sensitive material. Caspian read it at his desk, with a cup of black coffee cooling untouched beside him. Corvin Dre, age 27. Born in Glastonbury, Connecticut, no degree, employment history, construction laborer, nightclub bouncer, currently unemployed. 2 prior arrests, 1 for assault, charges dropped, 1 for disorderly conduct, 30 days suspended, no convictions. Known associates, minor street-level dealers, none connected to Caspian's network. Current address, 14 Marbeck Lane, East Hartford, same address as Leora Tenley. Relationship status, listed as her ex-partner on social services documentation, related to their son, Oren Dre Tenley, ex-partner. But living at the same address. Caspian read the file twice, then he read the arrest reports. The assault charge had been filed by a previous girlfriend, a woman named Thessaly Brigg, who had subsequently recanted her statement and refused to testify. The disorderly conduct had occurred outside a bar in New Britain, where Corvin had shattered a car window with his fist during an argument with an unidentified woman. Pattern. Caspian closed the file and sat in the silence of his office. Through the window, Hartford sprawled beneath him, a city of steeples and concrete, insurance companies and shadows. Somewhere in that city, in a small apartment on Marbeck Lane, a 23-year-old woman was going home to a man with a history of violence and a talent for avoiding consequences. And she was going willingly, and not because she wanted to, because she didn't believe she had the right to leave. It was a Friday evening in late October. The air was cold enough to justify the coat Caspian wore, a dark wool overcoat that made him look less like a man of his position and more like any other professional heading home after a long week. He drove himself, which he rarely did. A black sedan, unregistered to any name that led back to his organization. No driver, no tail car, no one knew where he was except himself. He parked on a side street 3 blocks from 14 Marbeck Lane at 5:38 p.m. The neighborhood was what real estate agents would call up and coming, which meant it was still struggling. The homes were a mix of duplexes and small apartment buildings, some well kept, most bearing the quiet erosion of deferred maintenance. Porches sagged. Gutters hung at angles. The cars parked along the curb were older models, functional but tired. A group of kids rode bicycles down the sidewalk, weaving between parked cars with the careless invincibility of childhood. An older man sat on his porch across the street from number 14, drinking something from a can and watching the traffic with the patient attention of someone who had nowhere else to be. A dog barked somewhere behind one of the houses, short, sharp barks, the kind that meant territory, not alarm. This was not the kind of neighborhood where Caspian Rivara spent time. His world existed in glass towers and renovated brownstones, in private dining rooms and conference suites, where the furniture alone cost more than any house on this street. But he had grown up in a neighborhood not unlike this one, before his father's organization had expanded, before the money had transformed their circumstances. And he recognized its rhythms. The sound of televisions through open windows, the smell of someone's dinner drifting across the street, the particular quality of light that fell on houses where people worked long hours and came home tired and made the best of what they had. Number 14 was a duplex. 2 stories. Beige siding that had once been white. A narrow front porch with a plastic chair and an overturned tricycle, Oren's presumably. The first floor windows were lit, the curtains were thin, and from his position across the street, Caspian could see the blurred movements of figures inside. The second floor unit appeared empty. No lights, no movement. EA for rent sign hung crookedly from the porch railing. The whole structure had the look of a building that its owner had stopped investing in, maintained just enough to collect rent and not a dollar more. He waited. At 5:52 p.m., Leora's car, a 12-year-old Honda Civic with a dented rear bumper, pulled into the short driveway. She got out quickly, opened the back door, and lifted Oren from his car seat. The boy wrapped his arms around her neck and pressed his face against her shoulder. She carried him up the porch steps, shifted him to one arm, and opened the front door. She paused at the threshold, just for a moment. A hesitation so brief, it could have been nothing. A fumbled key, a shifted grip on the child. But Caspian saw it for what it was. The pause of a person who does not want to enter their own home. She went inside, and for the next 40 minutes, nothing happened. Caspian sat in his car, watching the lit windows, seeing the occasional shadow pass behind the curtains. He could not hear what was happening inside. He could only watch the silhouettes, 2 adults, 1 child, moving through the muted glow of a home that, from the outside, looked ordinary. Then, at 6:34 p.m., the voices started. Not shouting, not at first. A man's voice, raised just above conversation level. The kind of volume that isn't technically yelling but carries the same threat. Caspian couldn't make out the words, but he could hear the cadence. Accusatory, relentless, building. Then Leora's voice. Quieter. Smaller. Trying to de-escalate. The same tone he'd heard on the phone call at the office. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, please." The man's voice got louder. A crash. Something heavy hitting something hard. A wall, a floor, a table. The kind of sound that vibrates through cheap construction and reaches the street. Through the thin curtains, Caspian saw a shadow move. Fast, aggressive. And then, another shadow, smaller, stumble backward. He saw the smaller shadow raise its arms, not in attack but in defense. The universal gesture, the crossed arms, the ducked head, the body curling in on itself to protect the soft places. There was another sound. Not a crash this time. Something different. The sound of a person's body making contact with a surface in a way that bodies should not. It was dull, final. The kind of sound that comes from force, applied to flesh by flesh. And then, worst of all, silence. Not peaceful silence. The loaded silence that follows impact. The silence of aftermath. The silence that fills a room when one person has been hurt and both people are deciding what to do next. One deciding how to minimize what just happened. The other deciding whether they can move. A light went on in the back of the apartment. A door closed. The bathroom, maybe. He could imagine what was happening behind that door without needing to see it. Leora standing at the sink, running cold water over whatever part of her body had taken the impact. Staring at her own reflection, constructing the explanation she would use tomorrow. "Oh, I tripped. I walked into the door. I'm so clumsy." He imagined Oren. Where was Oren? In his room? In his crib? Awake, listening to the sounds that no child should learn to interpret, or asleep, spared this one night, only to be woken the next by the same sounds, or worse. Dane Caspian's hands tightened on the steering wheel. His knuckles went white. He had controlled men who ran narcotics through 6 states. He had negotiated with people who would kill over a percentage point. He had sat across from federal agents and never once lost his composure. But this was different, because this wasn't business. This wasn't territory, or money, or power. This was a woman he had looked in the eye and asked, "Is someone hurting you?" And she had looked back at him and said, "No." And they had both known she was lying. He drove home. His residence was a renovated brownstone in West Hartford's most exclusive enclave, understated from the outside, immaculate within. He entered through the private garage, hung his coat in the hallway, and walked to his study without turning on the lights. And he poured himself a single measure of whiskey. He didn't drink it. Instead, he sat in the leather chair his mother had bought him when he'd purchased this house. The same chair she'd sat in during the final months of her illness, when she was too proud to use a hospital bed and too tired to climb the stairs. And he thought. He thought about his mother, about Isolde Rivera, who had been married to a man everyone feared and had never once been afraid of him. Because his father, for all his brutality in business, had operated under the same code that Caspian now carried. You do not harm those who trust you. You do not break what you claim to love. He thought about Leora's hands shaking in the interview. He thought about the scarf she wore in 74-degree heat. And he thought about the crash he'd heard through the thin walls of 14 Marbeck Lane and the silence that followed. And he thought about Corvin Dre, A 27-year-old man with no power, no ambition, no code, and no purpose except the systematic dismantling of a woman who believed she deserved it. Caspian made a decision that night. Not the decision people might expect from a man in his position. He did not call his enforcers, did not order retribution, did not set the machinery of his empire into motion against a man who, by every metric that mattered in his world, was insignificant. Instead, he picked up his phone and called someone he hadn't spoken to in 2 years, Dr. Aurelian Cobb. Aurelian was a psychologist who specialized in trauma and domestic violence. She ran a private practice in New Haven and consulted for 3 shelters in the region. She was also the only person outside his organization who knew the full truth about what Caspian Rivera did for a living, because she had treated his cousin Thessalina after a situation that had nearly destroyed the family. Aurelian, he said, I need your advice. It's 10 o'clock at night, Caspian. I know. She heard something in his voice. She always did, and her tone shifted. Tell me. He told her. Not everything. Not the surveillance, not the file on Corvin, but enough. A woman at his office, signs of abuse, denial when confronted, emotional dependency on the abuser. Aurelian listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. You can't force her to leave, she said. I know. If you confront her again, she may withdraw further. She may quit the job. I know. If you go after him directly, you'll confirm her fear that the world is dangerous and that she needs him to survive it. He's probably told her that no one else would want her, that she's lucky to have him. If you remove him, you remove her framework, and without support in place, she'll find another one just like him. What do I do? You create conditions. Safety, consistency. You let her know, without pressure, that there is a world outside that apartment where she is valued for who she is, not what she endures. You don't save her, Caspian. You give her the tools and the space to realize she can save herself. He was quiet. There's a legal aid organization in Hartford, Aurelian continued. Whitfield Resources. And they handle domestic situations, restraining orders, custody, housing. And there's a therapist I can recommend. Someone who specializes in exactly this kind of dependency. When she's ready, and I mean when she is ready, not when you decide she should be, these are the resources that will matter. And if she's never ready, then you accept that you did what you could, and that her choices, even the ones that hurt her, are still her choices. Caspian sat with the phone against his ear, the untouched whiskey on the table, the ghost of his mother in the chair across from him. Thank you, Aurelian. Be careful with this, Caspian. Your instinct is to control outcomes. This is not something you can control. He hung up. He sat in the dark for another hour. Then he went to bed, and he did not sleep. It was her eye, the left one. In the skin beneath it was swollen, discolored, a deep purple fading to green at the edges. She had tried to cover it with concealer, but the swelling defeated the makeup, and the result was a patchwork of skin tones that drew more attention than the bruise itself would have. She wore the sunglasses again. She kept them on at her desk. She kept them on in the break room. She kept them on when Emberly Voss stopped by her office to drop off a stack of filing, and Emberly, who had raised 4 daughters and recognized the geography of a black eye with the precision of a cartographer, stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary before walking away with a look on her face that was equal parts rage and sorrow. By noon, the whispers had started. Not cruel whispers. The staff at Rivera Holdings were, by and large, people who understood discretion, but concerned ones. Ransom Hetrick told Emberly he'd noticed the bruise. Emberly told Maddox. Maddox told Caspian. She's wearing sunglasses indoors, Maddox said. It's her eye. I know. What do you want me to do? Nothing yet. Maddox studied him. You've been watching her. I've been paying attention. Those are the same thing coming from you. Caspian stood from his desk. Clear my afternoon. What are you going to do? Talk to her. He found her in her office at 2:15 p.m. She was on the phone, not her cell, but the office line, confirming an appointment for one of the attorneys. When she saw Caspian in the doorway, Her voice faltered for just a moment before she recovered, finished the call, and hung up. Mr. Rivara. Take off the sunglasses. Leora. The directness of it, no preamble, no small talk, seemed to freeze her in place. She sat behind her desk with her hands flat on the surface, and he could see them trembling. They're for my migraine. I get these, say. Take them off. She didn't move. He stepped inside, closed the door, sat down across from her. The room was small enough that only the desk separated them, and in that confined space, the reality of what was happening became impossible to avoid. I'm not going to ask you if someone is hurting you, he said. We both know the answer. What I'm going to tell you is that what is happening to you is not your fault. It is not something you deserve, and it is not something that will get better on its own. Leora's composure, which had held through weeks of lies and smiles and long sleeves, began to fracture, and her lower lip trembled. She pressed her lips together to stop it. Her hands curled into fists on the desk. You don't understand, she said. Her voice was thick. He's not always like that. He has a temper, but he's working on it. He's trying. How long has he been trying? She didn't answer. How long, Leora? It's been since before Oren was born. But it wasn't bad at first. It was just, he'd get frustrated and sometimes She stopped, swallowed. He loves me. I know how that sounds. I know, but he does. He tells me all the time. He says he can't live without me. That's not love. You don't know him. I know what I see when you walk into this building. You see what you want to see. The words came out sharper than she'd intended, and she immediately retreated. Her eyes dropped, and her shoulders curved inward, and she shook her head as if apologizing for the outburst. I'm sorry. I didn't mean. Don't apologize for having a reaction. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and in that look, Caspian saw the war raging inside her. The part that knew the truth, fighting against the part that had spent years constructing a reality in which the truth didn't exist. He's Oren's father, she said quietly. He loves his son. When things are good, they're really good. He brings me flowers. He tells me I'm beautiful. He holds me and he cries sometimes. He tells me he's sorry. He tells me he'll change. Does he change? The silence was answer enough. I can't leave, she said. I don't have anywhere to go. My mother she's in Florida and she told me I made my bed. My friends, the ones I had, yet they don't come around anymore, and if I leave, he'll get custody. He's told me. He said his lawyer will prove I'm unfit. He said I'm the one with the problems. He said, her voice broke. He said if I leave, he'll find me. Caspian leaned forward. His voice when he spoke carried a quietness that was more powerful than volume. The controlled calm of a man who had learned that real authority doesn't need to be loud. Listen to me. What he tells you about custody, it's not true. There are organizations that exist specifically to help women in your situation navigate the legal system. What he tells you about being unfit, it's not true. You work, you care for your son. You show up every day to a job that you do with more diligence than people I pay 3 times your salary. What he tells you about finding you, that is a threat. And threats are something I understand very well. She shook her head. You don't know what he's capable of. I know exactly what he's capable of, and I'm telling you, not as your employer, but as someone who sees what is happening. You do not have to live this way. I love him. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. I know you believe that, Caspian said. It's not a belief. He's the father of my child. He's the only person who ever. When we first met, he was different. He was kind. He would bring me coffee in the morning and hold the door and call me just to hear my voice. I fell in love with that person, and I keep thinking he's still in there. That if I'm patient enough, if I don't push him, if I'm better, if you're better. I know what I do wrong. I know what sets him off. If I could I provoke him sometimes. I don't mean to, but Leora, stop. She stopped. You are not responsible for another person's violence. You are not the cause. You are not the trigger. No amount of being better will fix what is broken inside him, because what is broken inside him is not something you broke. She stared at him, Tears slid from beneath the sunglasses, tracing lines through the concealer she had applied so carefully that morning. "I don't know how to leave," she whispered. "I've tried, twice. I packed a bag, and I got as far as the car, and I couldn't do it. I kept thinking about what would happen to him, what he'd do, whether he'd hurt himself. He told me once that if I left he'd—" She couldn't finish. "He uses that," Caspian said. "He tells you he'll hurt himself because he knows it keeps you there. It's not love, Leora. It's a chain." She pulled the sunglasses off. The bruise was worse than it had looked through the tinted lenses, a deep, angry purple that spread from her cheekbone to the corner of her eye. She looked at him with an expression that was part defiance, part surrender, and part something he hadn't seen before in the weeks he'd known her. Maybe a small, fragile, almost invisible spark of recognition. "I'm scared," she said. "I know. I don't know who I am without him." "That is exactly what he wants you to feel." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Looked at the desk, looked at the filing cabinet, looked at the window overlooking the parking garage. The ordinary, mundane window of an ordinary, mundane office that had somehow become the safest place in her world. "What do I do?" she asked. And Caspian Rivara, a man who gave orders to hundreds, who moved money and power with the precision of a chess master, who had never once, in his adult life, been uncertain about a course of action, said the only thing he could say honestly: "When you're ready, there are people who can help. Not me. Professionals. People who understand what you're going through and who can help you build a path forward, a safe one, a legal one, one that protects you and your son." He placed a card on her desk, plain white, a phone number, a name, Whitfield Resources. "You don't have to call today," he said. "You don't have to call this week, but keep it, and know that the option exists." She picked up the card, held it, and turned it over in her fingers as if it were something fragile and dangerous, because for her, in that moment, it was. It was the physical manifestation of a choice she had spent years convincing herself she didn't have. "And if I'm not ready?" she asked. "Then you come to work tomorrow, and the day after that, and you will have a job and a desk and people who see you. That doesn't change." She nodded. He stood, walked to the door, paused. "Leora." "Yes?" "You asked me in the interview why I hired you." She waited. "I hired you because when I asked you why you wanted the job, you said, 'Because I need it.' That was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in years. Don't lose that honesty, especially not with yourself." He left. She sat in her office, holding the card, and cried for the first time in months, not the silent, any suppressed tears she had learned to produce and erase, but real, shaking, ugly sobs that she muffled with her hand, because even in her safest place, she was afraid of being heard. The event that changed everything happened on a Tuesday evening in November. Leora had left work at her usual time, picked up Oren from Ganara's, and driven home. She was carrying 2 bags of groceries and her son when she opened the front door and found Corvin sitting on the couch in the dark. He was not drunk. That was the first thing she noticed, because his worst moments usually coincided with alcohol. He was sober, alert, and watching the door as if he'd been waiting for her. "Where were you?" he said. "Work. Then I picked up Oren and stopped for groceries." "You're late." 5 minutes. And the line at the store was, "I called you. My phone was in my bag. I called you 4 times." She set the groceries on the counter, shifted Oren to her other hip. The boy was watching his father with those solemn, silent eyes, the eyes of a child who had learned to read atmospheric pressure the way sailors read the sky. "I'm sorry," Leora said. "I didn't hear it ring." Corvin stood. He was taller than her by several inches, heavier by 40 pounds. The remains of a muscular frame that had softened since he'd stopped working, but still carried the mass of a man accustomed to using his body as a tool. "Oh," he walked toward her slowly. "Who were you with?" "No one. I was at work and then You've been different lately." "I haven't. I'm the same as I've always." Someone's been talking to you. Her blood went cold. No one's been talking to me. Your boss, that guy, Rivara. He's my employer. We barely speak. Corvin was close now. Close enough that she could smell the cigarettes he'd smoked while waiting. Close enough that Oren pressed his face harder into her neck. If I find out you're lying to me, Leora, I'm not lying, I swear. I'm not lying. He looked at her for a long time. Then he smiled. That smile she knew, the one that could mean tenderness, or cruelty, or both. The one she had spent 5 years trying to decode. Make dinner, he said, and went back to the couch. She cooked, she fed Oren, she bathed him, and put him to bed in the small bedroom they shared, because Corvin had claimed the master bedroom for himself months ago. After an argument, she could no longer fully remember. She read Oren a story, kissed his forehead, and lay beside him until his breathing slowed. Then she went to the living room, where Corvin was watching television. Come here, he said. She went. He pulled her onto the couch beside him, put his arm around her, held her close, kissed her temple. I'm sorry, he said. I just worry about you. I love you, you know that. I know. I don't know what I'd do without you. I know. You're everything to me, Leora. You and Oren, you're my whole world. She leaned against him, closed her eyes, felt his heartbeat through his chest, and tried, as she had tried 1,000 times, to convince herself that this was the real Corvin. That the other one, the one who left bruises and broke things and made her son afraid to breathe, was an aberration. A glitch. Something that would eventually be corrected if she just loved him enough. This was the part she could never explain to anyone, not the violence. That was straightforward in its terrible way. People understood violence. What they didn't understand was this. The tenderness that followed. The softness. The version of Corvin who stroked her hair and whispered that he was sorry and held her as if she were the most precious thing in his world. This version was more addictive than any substance. Because this version was the reason she'd fallen in love with him in the first place, and every time he appeared, it confirmed the story she needed to believe, that the good version was the real one and the bad version was the exception. And Pernille would later call this intermittent reinforcement, the most powerful conditioning mechanism known to psychology. The same principle that kept gamblers at slot machines. You pull the lever 100 times and get nothing, and then a reward, a jackpot of tenderness. And that single reward wipes out the memory of 100 losses and makes you pull the lever again, because maybe this time, maybe the next time, maybe the real Corvin will stay. She had read about trauma bonding in a pamphlet she had found in a doctor's office waiting room once. She had read the descriptions of the cycle, tension, explosion, reconciliation, calm, and she had recognized every phase with a clarity that made her hands shake. But recognizing the cage and escaping the cage are different things. The bars are made of hope, and hope is the strongest material in the universe. But something was different tonight, because behind her driver's license, folded once and pressed flat, was a white card with a phone number. And for the first time, the card felt heavier than the arm around her shoulders. 3 days later, Corvin hit Oren. Not hard. Not the way he hit Leora. A shove, rough, sudden, because the boy had spilled milk on the carpet, and Corvin was on the phone, and the noise had interrupted him. He shoved the child with one hand, and Oren fell backward, hit the edge of the coffee table, and began to scream. Leora was in the kitchen. She heard the scream and came running. Oren was on the floor. There was a cut on his forehead, small but bleeding. He was crying with the open-mouthed, a gasping terror of a child who doesn't understand what has happened to him. Corvin was standing over him, phone still in his hand, looking at the boy with an expression that was not remorse, but annoyance. He needs to learn to be more careful, Corvin said. Something shifted inside Leora. It wasn't a dramatic realization. It wasn't a cinematic moment of clarity, accompanied by swelling music. It was quieter than that, smaller, more devastating. It was the sound of her son screaming, combined with the sight of blood on his face, combined with a look in Corvin's eyes. the complete absence of concern for a child he claimed to love, and it was the sudden, searing understanding that if she stayed, this would be Oren's life, not just hers, his. She would survive it. She had been surviving it for 5 years. And she could survive it for 5 more, because she had built an entire identity around the act of enduring. But Oren couldn't. Oren was 3 years old, and he was already afraid of loud noises, and he didn't babble the way other children did, and he flinched when doors closed too quickly, and if she didn't leave, he would grow up learning that love was something that left marks. She picked up her son. She cleaned the cut. She bandaged his forehead. She held him until he stopped crying. And then, at 9:47 p.m., while Corvin slept in the master bedroom, she took the white card from behind her driver's license. She sat on the bathroom floor with the door locked and the shower running to mask the sound. And she dialed the number. Whitfield Resources answered on the second ring. The woman on the line, Tamsin, as she said her name was, spoke with the calm, unhurried patience of someone who had answered calls like this hundreds of times and understood that the most important thing was not information, but presence. "Take your time," Tamsin said. "You don't have to tell me everything tonight. You just have to tell me what you need right now." "I need to leave," Leora whispered. "I have a son. He's 3. I don't have money. I don't have anywhere to go." "Okay, that's okay. We can help with all of that. Are you safe right now?" "He's asleep." "Okay, here's what I want you to do. Can you pack a bag tonight? Just the essentials. Documents, clothes for you and your son, anything you can't replace." "Yes. And tomorrow morning when it's safe, I want you to come to our office. I'm going to give you an address. Can you write it down?" "Yes." Tamsin gave her the address, gave her an appointment time, gave her the name of an intake counselor, Pernille, who would be waiting for her. "Leora," Tamsin said, "you've already done the hardest part." "What's that?" "You call." She packed the bag at 2 a.m. Quietly, methodically. Her hands shook, but her mind was clear, clearer than it had been in years. Birth certificates. Social security cards. Oren's vaccination records. 3 changes of clothes for each of them, his stuffed rabbit, the one he slept with, the one that smelled like home, her wallet, the white card tucked back behind her license like a talisman. She moved through the apartment like a ghost, opening drawers with the care of someone disarming a bomb. In every sound was amplified by the silence of the sleeping house, the slide of a zipper, the rustle of fabric, the click of the clasp on Oren's diaper bag. She had spent 5 years learning to be silent. Now, for the first time, that skill served her instead of her captor. She paused at the bedroom door. Corvin was asleep, sprawled across the mattress, one arm flung over the side, mouth open. He looked peaceful. He looked harmless. He looked like the man she had fallen in love with 6 years ago at a party in New Britain, when he'd made her laugh so hard she'd spilled her drink, and he'd wiped it up with his own shirt and said, "I'll ruin every shirt I own if it keeps you smiling." She stood in the doorway and looked at him, and she felt the pull, the gravitational force of a shared history, a shared child, a shared bed. And the pull said, "Stay. He'll be better tomorrow. He always is for a while. Go back to bed. Put the bag away. Nothing has to change tonight." She closed her eyes. She saw Oren's face, the cut on his forehead, the blood, the look of total incomprehension, the look of a child trying to understand why the person who was supposed to protect him had hurt him instead. She opened her eyes. She picked up the bag. She left the bedroom. She did not look back. She hid the bag in the trunk of her car before dawn. The street was empty. The sky was that particular shade of pre-dawn gray that exists only in the hour when the world hasn't decided whether to commit to morning. She stood in the driveway of 14 Marbeck Lane and breathed the cold November air, and she felt, beneath the terror, something she hadn't felt in so long, she almost didn't recognize it. Resolve, not courage. She would argue later in therapy that what she did was not courageous. Courage implied a choice made freely. What she did was an act of desperation by a woman who had finally hit the one line she could not cross, her son's safety. But desperation and resolve, in the right circumstances, look the same. They move the same way. They produce the same result. Forward motion when every instinct is screaming at you to stay still. She went to work. She picked up Oren from Gennara's. When she collected him, Gennara looked at the bag in the trunk. Leora hadn't closed it fully, and the corner of Oren's stuffed rabbit was visible. And Gennara said nothing. She hugged Leora, just held her, in the doorway, for a long time. And then she said, "Ikbo, you call me if you need anything, anything." She did not go home. She drove to Whitfield Resources. Caspian learned about it the following day. Not from Leora. She didn't come to work that morning, but from Maddox, who received a call from the building's HR department reporting her absence. She didn't call in, Maddox said. Caspian felt a cold knot form in his chest. Find out where she is. It took Maddox 30 minutes. A single call to a contact at the police department confirmed that no incidents had been reported at 14 Marbeck Lane. A second call to Whitfield Resources, facilitated by Aurelian, confirmed that Leora Tenley had walked through their doors at 8:15 a.m. with her son and a single bag. She was safe. Caspian sat at his desk and exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. The next part was delicate, and Caspian handled it with the same precision he applied to every operation that mattered. He did not contact Leora directly. He understood, through Aurelian's guidance, that the first 72 hours after leaving were the most dangerous and the most fragile, the period when the gravitational pull of the relationship was strongest, when the abuser's pleas and threats were loudest, and when the survivor was most likely to return. Instead, he acted behind the scenes. Through Maddox, he ensured that Leora's job remained secure. Her absence was coded as personal leave, paid, indefinite, no questions asked. Her desk was left exactly as she had left it. Her coffee mug, her pen cup, the small frame photograph of Oren she'd placed on the corner. Through Aurelian, he connected Whitfield Resources with additional funding, discreetly, anonymously, through a foundation that existed for exactly this purpose. The foundation had been established by his mother years ago, long before her death, and it was the one piece of the Rivara legacy that was entirely clean. Through his attorney, Evander Montrose, a man who handled legal matters for the organization with surgical precision, he ensured that Leora would have access to a family law attorney at no cost when she was ready to pursue custody and a restraining order. He did not go to Marbeck Lane. He did not confront Corvin Dre. He did not send anyone to deliver a message or a warning or a threat, not because the impulse wasn't there. It was like a current running beneath the surface of his control, but because Aurelian had been clear and he trusted her judgment. If he intervened directly with Corvin, he risked making Leora a target of retaliation and undermining the legal protections she would need. This was not his war to fight. It was hers. His role was to ensure she had the weapons. The first week at Whitfield Resources was the hardest. Leora and Oren were placed in transitional housing, a small, clean apartment in a secure building with a coded entrance and a staff member on site around the clock. The apartment had 2 rooms, a bedroom with a full-sized bed and a toddler cot, and a combined kitchen living area with a donated couch and a table that seated 2. It was nothing like 14 Marbeck Lane. It was better, and it was worse. Better because no one yelled, no one hit, no doors slammed at 2 a.m. Oren slept through the night for the first time in months, the whole night, without whimpering. Without crawling into his mother's bed at 3 a.m. with his rabbit clutched to his chest and his eyes wide. Worse because the silence was deafening. Because the bed was empty where Corvin's body should have been. Because Leora's phone, the number Corvin didn't have, didn't ring, and the absence of his voice, even his angry voice, felt like withdrawal. She missed him. She knew she shouldn't. She knew intellectually that what she missed was the version of him that existed, only in the spaces between violence. The tender Corvin, the apologetic Corvin, the one who held her and said he'd change. But intellectual knowledge and emotional experience are different languages, and her heart spoke one while her mind spoke the other, and the translation between them was agonizing. She cried every night for the first 5 days. Not for what she'd lost, but for what she wanted to go back to. The familiar pain that at least felt like home. On the 6th day, she met Pernilla. Pernille Huxley was a therapist on staff at Whitfield Resources. She was in her early 50s, with close-cropped silver hair and a voice that managed to be both warm and uncompromising at the same time. She specialized in trauma bonding and emotional dependency, the specific psychological architecture that kept people tethered to those who harmed them. Their first session lasted 90 minutes. "Tell me about the first time he hurt you," Pernilla said. Leora didn't want to answer. She sat in the small office with her hands in her lap. That same gesture Caspian had noticed in the interview, and the pressed-together hands that meant that she was holding herself in place. And she looked at the floor. "It wasn't. He didn't hit me at first. It started with the phone." The phone. He wanted to know where I was all the time. He'd call, and if I didn't answer, he wouldn't hit me, but he'd be upset, silent, cold. And the silence was worse because I didn't know what it meant. Was he angry? Was he going to leave? Was it my fault for not answering? So you started answering faster. Always, even if I was driving, even if I was in the shower, I'd run to the phone because the thought of missing his call was, I can't explain it. It felt like life or death. It felt that way because he trained you to feel that way. Leora was quiet for a long time. "And the hitting?" Pernilla asked gently. "That came later, maybe a year in. After Oren was born, I was tired all the time. The baby was crying and Corvin wanted things to be the way they were before, and I couldn't. I couldn't be both things. A new mother and the girl he fell in love with. He said I'd changed. He said I didn't care about him anymore. He said I loved the baby more than I loved him." She paused, breathed. The first time he grabbed my arm. Hard. Hard enough to leave marks. He apologized immediately. He cried. He said he didn't know what happened, that something snapped, that it would never happen again. And I believed him, not because I was naive, because I needed to believe him, because if that wasn't true, then everything I'd built my life around was a lie and I couldn't face that. And the second time? A month later, he pushed me. I hit the counter. He apologized again. Same words, same tears, same promise. And I believed him again. Because believing him was easier than the alternative. What was the alternative? Being alone. Starting over. Admitting I'd made a mistake. Admitting that the father of my child was someone I should be afraid of. My mother had told me, when I got pregnant at 19, that I was ruining my life. That I'd never amount to anything. That I'd made my bed. And if I left Corvin, then she was right. About everything. "So you stayed to prove your mother wrong." The words landed like a stone in still water. Leora stared at Pernille. No one had ever articulated it so precisely. She had spent years constructing elaborate justifications for staying, love, commitment, family, hope. And Pernille had just named the one she'd never admitted to herself, pride, and the refusal to confirm someone else's low expectations of her. "When did I stop being me?" Pernilla leaned forward. "You didn't stop. You adapted. Everything you did. The vigilance, the phone, the explanations, the excuses. Those were survival strategies. They kept you alive. They protected your son. But they were never who you are. They were what you did to get through. So who am I? That's what we're going to find out." Week 2. Leora began attending group sessions at Whitfield. She sat in a circle with 5 other women, different ages, different backgrounds, the same wounds. She didn't speak during the first session. She listened. She heard Thessaly, who was 29, describe how her ex had isolated her from her family by telling her they didn't really care about her, how he had slowly, methodically, he dismantled every relationship she had until he was the only person left. He made me believe they abandoned me, Thessaly said. But he was the one locking the doors. She heard Carenza, who was 44, explain how she'd gone back 4 times before the 5th time stuck. Carenza was a registered nurse. She had a master's degree. She understood, on a clinical level, exactly what was happening to her, could name the cycle, could identify the hormones, could diagram the neuroscience of trauma bonding, and still she went back. 4 times. Because knowing and feeling are different things, Carenza said. My brain knew, my body didn't care. My body was addicted to the cycle, the terror, the relief, the tenderness that came after. It's the same chemistry as any other addiction. And you don't beat an addiction just because you understand it. She heard Marigold, who was 20, talk about the night she realized her boyfriend's apologies were a script he performed to keep her in place. He said the same words every time, Marigold said. Exact same words. I don't know what came over me. You know I'd never hurt you on purpose. I love you more than anything. And I finally realized he wasn't sorry. He was pressing a button, the apology button, the one that reset me back to 0 so he could do it again. She heard Selene, who was 37 and had left her husband of 12 years, describe the specific loneliness of the first week. People think the hard part is leaving, Selene said. The hard part is the silence. You go from a house full of chaos to a room where the only sound is your own breathing. And your brain doesn't know what to do with that. It interprets the silence as danger, because for years, silence was what came right before the explosion. So you sit in your safe apartment and your body is in fight or flight because it can't tell the difference between peace and the calm before the storm. By the end of the session, Leora was crying. Not from sadness. From recognition. That's what it feels like, she told Pernille afterward. Hearing other people say the same words, the exact same words. I'm clumsy. He's working on it. He didn't mean it. It's like we all read from the same book. Because the patterns are the same, Pernille said. The abuser's playbook doesn't change. The details change. The names, the places, the specific acts. But the architecture is identical. Isolation, control, intermittent reinforcement, blame reversal. It works because it's designed to work. So I'm not stupid. You were never stupid. You were trapped in a system that was built to make you feel like you couldn't leave. Week 3. Leora returned to work. She walked into Rivara Holdings at 8:02 a.m. 2 minutes late, which she would have apologized for profusely a month ago, but now simply noted and moved past. Her desk was exactly as she'd left it. The coffee mug, the pen cup, Oren's photograph. She sat down, turned on her computer, opened the first file, and she breathed. Emberly Voss appeared in her doorway 10 minutes later with a cup of coffee, not from the break room, but from the cafe across the street. The good kind. The kind Leora had never bought herself, because she'd always considered it an unnecessary expense. Welcome back, Emberly said, and set the cup on her desk. Thank you. No questions, no commentary, just the cup and the 2 words, and the quiet understanding between 2 women who didn't need to say more. Ransom Hetrick stopped by at lunch. Hey, glad you're back. Me too. Maddox appeared in her office at 3 p.m. with a stack of files that needed organizing and a briskness in his manner that communicated, more clearly than warmth could have, that she was needed, not pitied, needed. These are a mess, he said, dropping the stack on her desk. Whoever filed them last should be fired. Oh wait, that was me. She almost laughed. Almost. The muscles were rusty, but they remembered. She did not see Caspian that day. Not because he wasn't there. He was on the top floor, aware of her return, aware of everything. But because he understood that his presence, at this point, would carry too much weight. He was the man who had asked, the man who had pushed, and right now, what she needed was normalcy, not the person who had witnessed her at her most vulnerable. But she found an envelope on her desk at the end of the day, no name on it. Inside, a single sheet of paper from the HR department confirming that her health insurance had been upgraded to include mental health coverage, therapy, psychiatry, and family counseling, effective immediately. She held the paper for a long time. The legal process began in week 4. Evander Montrose's associate, a family law attorney named Jessamy Thorne, met with Leora at Whitfield Resources to discuss her options. Jessamy was precise, patient, and thorough. She explained the process for a protective order. She explained custody law. She explained that Corvin's criminal history, combined with documented evidence of abuse, gave Leora a strong case for sole custody. Evidence? Leora asked. Medical records. Photographs if you have them. Witness statements. Employment records showing patterns of absence. I didn't take pictures. I didn't think anyone would believe me. People will believe you, Jessamy said. And the medical records from your emergency room visits? The one in August and the one in June, those are documented. Leora stared at her. How did you know about those? Jessamy simply looked at her. We do our research. The protective order was filed the following week. Corvin was served at 14 Marbeck Lane by a process server at 10 a.m. on a Wednesday, and he was ordered to maintain a distance of 500 feet from Leora, from Oren, from her workplace, and from the transitional housing facility. The process server later told Jessamy Thorne that when Corvin opened the door and read the documents, his face went through a transformation that the server, a man who had delivered thousands of legal documents in his career, described as chilling. Not anger, not confusion. A calm, flat nothing followed by a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Tell her she's making a mistake, Corvin said. The process server said nothing, because that was his training. Tell her I love her, Corvin added. And then he closed the door. He called her. She didn't answer. He called again, and again, 17 times in 1 hour, each call a slight variation of the same message, some pleading, some angry, and some tender, some threatening. The voicemails, which Jessamy would later use as evidence in the custody hearing, were a master class in manipulation. Baby, please, I love you. I need to talk to you. Just give me 5 minutes. I can change. I'm already changing. Why are you doing this to us? To our family? You're taking my son away from me. How can you do this? After everything I've done for you, you know you can't make it on your own. You know that. Come home. Just come home and we'll figure it out. We always figure it out. 17 messages, 17 variations of the same thing. Without me, you are nothing. She didn't answer. On the 18th call, she blocked the number, and then she sat on the bathroom floor. The bathroom in her new apartment. The safe one. The quiet one. And she pressed her phone against her chest and shook and cried and breathed and didn't call him back. Each of those 17 voicemails pulled at something inside her. Each one found a different thread. The guilt, the love, the fear, the obligation, the hope, and tugged. A month ago, the 10th voicemail would have broken her. She would have called back. She would have driven to Marbeck Lane. She would have walked through that door and into his arms and told herself that this time, it would be different. But a month ago, she hadn't sat in a circle with 5 other women who had heard the same voicemails from different men. A month ago, she hadn't heard Pernille name the pattern. Hoovering, they called it. The abuser's attempt to vacuum the victim back in. A month ago, she hadn't learned that the tenderness in those messages was not love but strategy. She knew now, and knowing didn't make it hurt less, but it made her stay on the bathroom floor instead of getting in the car. The months that followed were not a fairy tale. There were setbacks. There were nights when Leora lay awake and missed the weight of his body beside her, not because it was safe, but because it was familiar, and familiarity, even painful familiarity, has a gravity that is hard to escape. There were mornings when she stood in front of the mirror and heard his voice in her head. You're nothing without me. No one else would put up with you. You're lucky I'm here. And she had to close her eyes and breathe and remind herself that the voice was a recording, not a prophecy. And there was one night, 3 weeks after leaving, when she almost went back. She was sitting in the transitional apartment with Oren asleep in the next room, and the silence was so complete and so unfamiliar that it felt like suffocation. She picked up her phone. She opened her contacts. She stared at the blocked number, and her thumb hovered over the unblock button, like a recovering addict reaching for the bottle they know will destroy them. She didn't press it. But the fact that she almost did terrified her more than anything Corvin had ever done to her. Because it meant that the damage wasn't just in her body. The bruises healed, the ribs stopped hurting, the black eye faded. The damage was in her wiring, in the neural pathways that had been carved over 5 years into a groove that led back to him. And the grooves didn't disappear when she walked out the door. They were still there, still pulling, still whispering that the known pain was safer than the unknown freedom. She told Pernilla about that night in their next session. Pernilla didn't look alarmed. She didn't look disappointed. She looked at Leora with the same steady, unshakable calm she always had and said, "You didn't call him." "I almost did." Almost is the whole point. Almost means you had the impulse and you chose differently. That's not failure, Leora. That's the opposite of failure. That's a woman who is learning in real time to override the programming that was installed without her consent. It doesn't feel like winning. It won't, not yet. Winning feels like nothing for a while. It feels like the absence of the chaos you're accustomed to. And your nervous system doesn't know what to do with peace. It interprets peace as boredom, and boredom as danger, because in your old life, quiet moments were just the space between storms. Learning to tolerate peace is part of the process. It takes time. How much time? As much as you need. Pernilla called it detoxing from a person. Trauma bonds don't break cleanly, she told Leora during their twice-weekly sessions. They unravel, thread by thread, and each thread hurts because you wove them yourself. You built a life around this bond. You built an identity. Letting go of it feels like letting go of yourself. So who do I become? Whoever you choose. Month 3. Leora was granted temporary sole custody of Oren. The hearing was brief. Jessamy Thorne presented the evidence, the medical records. In the police reports from Corvin's prior arrests, the testimony of Janara Foltz, who had noticed Oren's behavioral changes, and a letter from Pernille Huxley outlining the psychological impact of exposure to domestic violence on a 3-year-old child. Corvin appeared with a court-appointed attorney. He was clean-shaven, wearing a suit that didn't fit well, and he looked at Leora across the courtroom with an expression that was designed to communicate remorse, but that she now recognized, thanks to months of therapy and group sessions, as performance. He looked good. That was the cruelest part. He had gotten a haircut. He was wearing cologne, the same one he'd worn when they first started dating, and the scent reached her across the courtroom and hit her like a physical blow. But her body responded before her mind could intervene. The quickened pulse, the flush of warmth, the automatic softening that years of conditioning had wired into her nervous system. Her body still loved him. Her body hadn't gotten the memo. She gripped the edge of the table. She looked at Jessamy Thorne, who gave her a small, steady nod. She looked at the judge. She looked at the American flag behind the bench. And she breathed. She did not look at Corvin again. When his attorney argued that Corvin was a loving father who deserved the opportunity to maintain a relationship with his son, Leora felt the old guilt surge, the familiar voice that said, "You're taking his father away. You're breaking up a family. This is your fault." But Pernilla had prepared her for this moment. They had practiced it. He literally rehearsed it in therapy. The guilt would come, and she would let it come, and she would not follow it. "The guilt is not yours," Pernilla had said. "He built it. He installed it. It's his construction, not your truth." She did not look away. She did not cry. She sat in her chair with her hands steady for the first time in as long as she could remember, and she let the process do what processes do. Temporary sole custody. Granted. Supervised visitation. Approved. Contingent on Corvin's completion of a court-mandated anger management program. Leora walked out of the courtroom and into the November sunlight, and she stood on the steps, and she breathed. Oren was at Janara's. She would pick him up in an hour. She would take him home, to their home, the transitional apartment that was slowly becoming something more permanent. On something that smelled like the lavender candles she'd started buying, and the oatmeal she made every morning, and the detergent she chose herself because she could choose things now. She called Pernille from the courthouse steps. "How do you feel?" Pernille asked. "Terrified." "Good. Good." Terrified means you're feeling something real. For years you numbed yourself to survive. Terror is honest. It means you're alive. Month 5. Leora moved into a permanent apartment, a one-bedroom, in a complex that Whitfield Resources had helped her secure through a housing assistance program. It was small. It was hers. She painted Oren's corner of the bedroom a pale blue, and he helped her, his small hands covered in paint, laughing in a way she hadn't heard him laugh in over a year. The first night in the new apartment, she couldn't sleep. Not from fear. The building had a security system, a coded entrance, and neighbors who had been screened by the housing program. She couldn't sleep because the bed was positioned against a wall that faced west, and through the window she could see the lights of Hartford stretching toward the horizon, and it occurred to her that she had never chosen where she lived. She had lived with her mother until she was 17. She had lived with Corvin from 17 onward. Every address on every form she had ever filled out was someone else's decision. This address was hers. She lay in bed with Oren curled against her. He still preferred sleeping close to her, a habit she didn't rush to break. And she listened to the sounds of the building, pipes, footsteps on the floor above. The faint hum of the refrigerator. She had stocked herself with groceries. She had chosen herself, with money she had earned herself. She cried. But they were different tears. They were the tears of someone arriving somewhere after a long journey. Not tears of grief, but tears of recognition. She was here. She was actually here. She enrolled in an online program to complete her associate degree. She worked during the day and studied at night, and on weekends she took Oren to the park and watched him run and play and make sounds, loud sounds, joyful sounds, the sounds of a child who was learning that it was safe to be heard. The first time Oren threw a tantrum in the new apartment, a full-blown 3-year-old meltdown over being told he couldn't have ice cream before dinner. Leora froze. In the old life, noise meant danger. On a child's scream, a raised voice, even the clatter of a dropped toy. These were triggers that set off a chain reaction, ending in violence. She stood in the kitchen holding a box of pasta, and her body locked, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But there was no other shoe. There was only a 3-year-old lying on the kitchen floor, howling about ice cream. There was no one else to hear. No one who would storm in demanding silence. No one who would blame her for not controlling the child. She set down the pasta. She sat on the floor next to her son, and she let him scream. When he was done, when the storm had passed, and he lay breathing hard on the linoleum with tears drying on his round cheeks, she scooped him up and held him. "It's okay to be loud," she told him. "It's okay to be mad. Oh, we can be loud here." He looked at her with those dark eyes, her eyes, and he said in his small, tentative voice, "Promise. Promise." It was such a small thing, such an ordinary moment between a mother and a child, but for Leora, it was everything, because she had just given her son the one thing she had never been given, permission to feel. At work, she was given additional responsibilities. Maddox, impressed by her organizational skills, moved her into a coordination role that involved managing schedules for the firm's legitimate business operations. She excelled. Not because she was trying to prove anything, but because for the first time, the energy she had spent on survival was available for other things. She started eating lunch in the break room instead of at her desk. And she learned that Ransom Hetrick was training for a half marathon, and that Emberly Voss had a daughter in medical school, and that Maddox, stern, silver-haired Maddox, had a weakness for the banana bread that the cleaning crew's supervisor made every Friday. She was not healed. She would later tell Pernille that she didn't think healed was the right word, that it implied a destination, a finish line, and what she was experiencing felt more like a direction, a way of walking, a practice. But she was walking. 7 months after she left Marbache Lane, Leora knocked on the door of Caspian Rivera's office. She had never been to the top floor. She had never sought him out, not once, in all the months she'd worked there. Their interaction had been limited to the interview, the conversations about the bruises, and the card he'd placed on her desk. Everything else, the insurance, the legal help, the job security, had arrived through other hands, other names, other channels. But she knew. She knocked. Maddox opened the door, looked at her, and stepped aside without a word. Caspian was at his desk. He looked up. She stood in the doorway of his office. The same woman who had walked into a conference room 8 months ago with shaking hands and a borrowed blouse and a resume that said more in what it omitted. But different. Her posture was straighter, her eyes were clearer. She wore a blouse that fit her shoulders and shoes that were new and hands that, while they rested at her sides, did not tremble. Mr. Rivara, Miss Tenley. She walked to the chair across from his desk and sat down. She didn't wait for permission. And she sat because she chose to, and the difference between obedience and choice was something she now understood in a way that informed everything she did. I came to say thank you. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. I want to. He looked at her. And for the first time she looked back without flinching. You saw me, she said. Before I could see myself, you saw what was happening, and instead of looking away, the way everyone else did, the way I needed everyone to do so I could keep pretending, you didn't look away. Anyone would have, no, they wouldn't have. I walked through that world for 5 years and no one asked. My mother didn't ask. My friends, the ones who were left, they didn't ask. My doctor who treated the burns and the falls and the accidents didn't ask. You asked. And when I lied, and you didn't accept it. He was quiet. You didn't save me, she said. I want you to know that I understand that. You didn't kick down the door. You didn't threaten him. You didn't carry me out. You gave me a card, a phone number, a choice, and that. Her voice thickened, but she didn't stop. That was the most respectful thing anyone has ever done for me. You treated me like someone who was capable of saving herself. No one had ever done that before. Caspian Rivara, who negotiated with senators and managed an empire and never, in his adult memory, had been at a loss for words, sat behind his desk and said nothing. Because there was nothing to say that wouldn't diminish what she had just given him. Oren is doing well, she said. He talks now. A lot, actually. He told me yesterday that he wants to be a firefighter. A good ambition. And I'm finishing my degree. I'll have my associates by spring. Good. She stood, extended her hand. He took it. Her grip was firm. Steady. Thank you, Mr. Rivara. Caspian. She smiled. A real smile. Not practiced, not performed, not designed to conceal or convince. A smile that came from a place inside her that had been dark for 5 years and was now, slowly and imperfectly, filling with light. Thank you, Caspian. She left his office. The door closed. He sat at his desk and looked out the window at Hartford, the city of steeples and concrete, insurance companies and shadows. And he thought about his mother, about the code she had given him, about the things a man with power must never tolerate. And he thought about Leora Tenley, a woman who had been invisible, who had been shaking, who had worn long sleeves in warm rooms and sunglasses indoors and lies that fit so well they might have lasted a lifetime, who had, against every odd and every fear and every voice that told her she couldn't, chosen herself. Not because someone saved her, because someone saw her, and because in the end, she decided to see herself. Oren Tenley turned 4 in March. His birthday party was held in the community room of his mother's apartment complex. There were balloons. There was cake, chocolate, his favorite, baked by Gennara Foltz, who still watched him on weekdays and now did so because she wanted to, not because Leora had no other choice. 8 children attended. Oren was loud. He laughed. He ran. He blew out his candles with a force that sent frosting across the table. And then everyone cheered, and he looked at his mother with a grin so wide it seemed to occupy his entire face. Leora stood in the corner of the community room with a cup of punch and watched her son. She was 24 now. She had her associate degree. She had been promoted at Rivara Holdings to operations coordinator. She had a therapist she saw weekly and a support group she attended bi-weekly, and a life that, while far from perfect, was hers. She still had bad days, days when the old voice crept in. Corvin's voice, telling her she was nothing, telling her she'd fail, telling her no one would ever love her the way he did. On those days, she called Pernilla, or she called Tamsin at Whitfield, or she sat with a feeling and breathed through it, the way Pernilla had taught her, in letting it move through her body, without letting it move her feet. She did not go back. Corvin Dre had completed his court-mandated anger management program and was granted supervised visitation. He saw Oren twice a month in a monitored facility. He had, as far as Leora knew, not changed. But he was no longer her problem to fix. He was his own. She thought about him less now, not never. The thoughts still came, especially at night, especially in the moments between waking and sleeping, when the mind loosens its grip on the present and wanders back to the past. She would think about the early days, before the hitting, before the control, the way he'd show up at her apartment with Chinese food and a movie, the way he'd put his hand on her knee while driving and say nothing and mean everything. Those memories were the hardest to release because they were real. The good moments were real. They had just been planted in poisoned soil. Pernilla had given her a framework for this. You can grieve the good parts without going back for them, she'd said. You can miss someone and know you're safer without them. Those things aren't contradictions. They're the truth. And Leora Tenley, who had once believed she was nothing, who had once worn her bruises like a second skin, who had once sat in an interview with shaking hands and said, "Because I need it," with such honesty that it stopped a powerful man in his tracks. Leora Tenley was still walking, not healed, not finished, not arrived, walking. And that was enough.